Hey, I'm Ben Avery, and this is Strangers and Aliens. Strangers and Aliens is a podcast about science fiction, fantasy, faith, and Christianity. And this series right here, I just wanted to take some time and try something new. And I know I'll do this at least three times, three times, because I'm talking about a trilogy, and I'm going to do one of these for each book in the trilogy. But this series, I'm calling it Is It Worth Reading? And what I'm doing is just taking a quick look at science fiction written by Christians, science fiction written by believers, and taking a look at whether or not it's worth you spending your time either tracking it down and then spending your time reading it or listening to it or whatever it might be, however you prefer to consume your books. Now, the book I'm going to talk about today, we've done some podcast episodes that take a much closer look at it over at strangersandaliens.com. You can also find those episodes anywhere you find your podcast and do your podcast listening. But this book is from a favorite series of mine, and that series is right here, and the book is right here, Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis. Now, when I ask the question, is it worth reading, there's going to be a yes or no answer, and there's kind of a binary yes or no, it's worth it, it's not. But there's also going to be some context to what makes it worth reading and also why it's worth reading, because it may not be worth reading simply because it's a good book. It might be worth reading for other reasons, and that's the case for this book right here, Out of the Silent Planet. It was written in 1938 by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia books, C.S. Lewis, who wrote Screwtape Letters and Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis, who is one of my favorite writers, probably my favorite writer of all time. He definitely wrote two of my favorite books of all time. In fact, he wrote the book that is the number one book for me that I love more than any other book. And it's a book that has done something that no other author has done in the printed word, and that is it moved me to tears. That's Till We Have Faces. And again, we've talked about it on the podcast, on the audio podcast. Go to strangersandaliens.com if you want to hear some longer conversations about that with me and my co-hosts. But C.S. Lewis, I mean, the man, he was the right person at the right time to do a lot of different things that he did. He was the right person as far as his knowledge of theology. He was the right person because of his knowledge of literature. He was the right person because of just the way he explains things and breaks things down. And Out of the Silent Planet, it's a thin book. That alone might make it worth reading, because one of the categories that I would use when I'm saying is it worth reading is it worth reading as sci-fi homework, and specifically here, Christian sci-fi homework. If you're a Christian and you're wanting to get a good background and what happened in science fiction and in Christian literature. And so I would definitely say, yes, this is worth reading as homework, because this is a book that wasn't just popular because it was written by a believer. It is a book that was popular because it actually got good reviews as a science fiction novel at the time in 1938. Now you have to remember, in 1938, this is before World War II. This is before the atom bomb. And the atom bomb changed science fiction in a lot of ways, and changed the way people look at science, which also changed the way people wrote fiction about science. This is also before, any rockets have gone into space. That's another just moment in time that just changed the way people wrote their science fiction and changed the way people wanted to see their science fiction. The moon landing happening in the late 60s just created a whole new craze for space flight books and things like that. And up until that point, the books that they were writing about flying into space and going into space, they were fantasy, because they were only able to kind of conjecture what scientists were talking about was possible. And so then in the fiction, they were kind of looking at, okay, what do the scientists say is possible, and how can we make a good book out of that? And that's what C.S. Lewis is doing right here. He kind of has to take a little bit of H.G. Wells' style of science for getting people into space, which is to make stuff up, okay? And that's what they had to do. This is 1938. So the other thing is that this is kind of coming at the end of what I call the adolescence of science fiction. And so this is just before that golden age where science fiction is just kind of exploding all over the place. And so this book came, again, right place, right time. He writes this book, And so as a science fiction book, I think it's worth reading as science fiction homework just to see like what were they talking about when they're thinking about space. C.S. Lewis had no idea what was going to happen, and so his spaceship is not scientific at all, but it works in the context of what he was doing as a story. But then it also works as a Christian novel as well, because it does take a look at theological ideas, and it does take a look at just things that cause you to think about the relationship between man and God. And there's some really interesting things that happen in the book that deal with those issues. So yes, if you're looking at should I read it because it exists and it will give me a little bit more knowledge about the foundation of Christian science fiction, yes, this is a foundational book. And it's also foundational because this is, in some ways, I would say is worth reading, yes, as a prequel to one of the greatest works of Christian, not just Christian sci-fi literature, but Christian literature of all time. This is a prequel to Paralandra. Now, it wasn't written as a prequel. This was just written as a book, and then he wrote the next book. But in some ways, you almost have to look at this as a prelude. You know, this is a very thin book. The book that follows, Paralandra, not much thicker, but this lays the foundation of who the characters are. The two main characters of Paralandra, they show up in this book. Actually, I guess the three main characters of Paralandra show up in this book. I should say the three human main characters in Paralandra show up in this book. And one non-human, doesn't matter. Point is, there's the groundwork that gets laid here as far as like the universe, the world building that he uses in Paralandra. The groundwork is laid here. The character who shows up, your primary protagonist who shows up in Paralandra is the primary protagonist in this book. And so you have this working as a prequel. In fact, one of the ways I would describe this book, especially if people are thinking, oh, is it great? Is it good? Should I read it? This book reminds me a lot of the first season of Babylon 5, which I actually just finished rewatching. First season of Babylon 5 it's a pretty good science fiction series, but that first season isn't the greatest, and sometimes can be a little bit of a slog to get through. And that's true of a lot of science fiction, actually a lot of television, where you have that first season and they're just figuring out who they are. They're figuring out who the characters are. The actors are figuring it out. The writers are figuring it out. And we as viewers are figuring it out. And so you have that first season, second season of Star Trek Next Generation, which we watched, we loved, and I'll still watch episodes from those seasons, but they laid the groundwork for some amazing sci-fi to come. Same with Babylon 5. That first season of Babylon 5, it's okay, but it lays the groundwork for some of the best science fiction television you're ever going to watch. And that's the case here. This is laying the groundwork for some of the best science fiction, or if you really want to get nitty-gritty about it, science fantasy, because the science isn't the greatest here, but it sets the stage for Paralandra to come. And then the other thing I would say is it worth reading? I would say yes, it's worth reading just as a good book. It really is. There's an interesting story. There's interesting characters. There's an interesting world that the main character is walking through. And so I would say yes, this is a book worth reading. Find it, check it out. If you're a Christian and you want to read, early science fiction by Christians, this is a book to go to. And if you're not a Christian, I think honestly this is still a good book to read. It's going to have ideas in there that you may not agree with, especially some of the theological or moral ideas that are in here. But hopefully you'd also engage with it, because that's what any good book does. A good book is going to be something that causes you to think or to feel. A great book is going to cause you to do both. And, whether it's, a mystery that's causing you to think about who done it, or whether it's something like this that's causing you to think about some of the ideas of space colonization and some of the ideas of sin and sin nature and some of the ideas of, living in a fallen world. And I just have to say also, though, I love Mars in this book. I love Mars in this book. I love the planet. I love the way that it's portrayed as this kind of, well, I'm not going to say too much. I'm not going to say too much. But if you have not read this, then I recommend grab it, read it, and then head over to strangersandaliens.com and find our episode there. Listen to that, and after you've read the book, and let us know what you think. If you have read it, let me know what you think down in the comments below. But anyway, yeah. So the answer, is it worth reading? Yes. Thanks for watching. See you later. Godspeed.